Hey, dear members of the Soul Stories family. Today we will bring you a romantic love story, so let's get started. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any meaningful stories. Chapter 1. Prologue, The Hug. A light drizzle fell steadily on the cobblestone streets of Portland, Oregon, like a thin veil draped across the gray sky. It was late October, and the autumn air carried the characteristic chill of the Pacific Northwest. Emily Carter, 29, stepped out from the back door of Powell's Books, the city's most famous used bookstore, dragging a heavy black trash bag behind her. She wore a faded yellow raincoat with worn sleeves, her damp light brown hair clinging to her cheeks. Her old rubber boots hit the ground, making soft squelching sounds on the wet alley pavement that led behind St. Mary's Church. Her breath puffed out in small white clouds in the cold air. She paused for a moment, looking up at the vibrant red maple leaves trembling under the rain, as if they too were trying to hold on to the last traces of warmth before the long winter. It was a rare peaceful moment in her busy workday, sorting old books, chatting with customers, and sometimes quietly reading a page in a hidden corner of the shop. But then a strange sound broke the stillness, a stifled, broken sob echoing from the deep shadows of the alley. Emily tilted her head, listening. The crying wasn't loud, but it carried a pain she could feel, like an old wound torn open. She set the trash bag down, wiped her hands on her faded canvas apron, and walked slowly toward the sound. The rain soaked through her coat, making her shiver slightly, but she didn't care. Something about that cry stirred her heart, an instinct she couldn't explain. As she drew closer, the faint glow of a distant street lamp illuminated a figure. A man sat slumped beside a dumpster, his head bowed, shoulders shaking. He wore an expensive black suit, but it was disheveled, soaked and stained from the ground. His polished leather shoes were caked with mud, and his hand clutched a small, glinting object, a gold wedding ring, lying abandoned on the pavement like a discarded promise. He didn't look up, only continued to cry, his suppressed sobs as if he were trying to hide his pain from the world, but failing. Emily stood still for a moment, her breath blending with the patter of the rain. She didn't know who he was or what had reduced a man in such an elegant suit to this broken state, but she understood that feeling, the sense of loss, of emptiness, like when she stood by the graves of her parents and little brother after the car accident 7 years ago, or when she discovered her fiancé, the man she'd trusted completely, embracing her best friend in the apartment they'd chosen together. 3 years since canceling her engagement, she'd learned to keep going, not by forgetting, but by opening her heart to those who needed her. And right now, this man clearly needed someone. Without another thought, Emily stepped forward and knelt beside him. Her knees touched the cold ground, rainwater seeping through her thin jeans, but she didn't notice. She placed a hand on his shoulder gently, the way she'd once comforted children lost in the bookstore looking for their mothers. He flinched, looking up briefly, his eyes red and blurred with tears and rain, then dropped his head again, as if ashamed to be seen at his weakest. But Emily didn't leave. She pulled him into a hug, not too tight, just enough for him to feel her presence. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the damp earth and rain, creating a strange fragrance she'd never forget. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered, her voice soft but firm, like a promise. "I'm just here." He didn't reply, but she felt his body gradually relax in her arms. His crying quieted, blending into the steady sound of the rain. They sat like that for a long time. Two strangers, nameless, without pasts, connected only by shared pain in the dark alley. Emily didn't ask anything, didn't need to know who he was or what had happened. To her, sometimes a hug was enough to say what words couldn't reach. Finally, when his sobs stopped completely, Emily let go. He still didn't look up, just silently wiped his face with a wet sleeve. She stood, intending to leave, but then her eyes caught the wedding ring lying on the ground. It was tiny, glinting under the streetlight, like a shard of a shattered dream. She bent down to pick it up, her cold fingers brushing the cool gold. She didn't know why she did it. Maybe instinct, maybe curiosity. But she quietly slipped the ring into his suit pocket, then turned away without another word. As she walked back to the rear door of Powell's, the rain continued its steady rhythm, like a wordless, sad song. She glanced back one last time. The man still sat there motionless, but the ring was now in his pocket, a mystery she wasn't sure she wanted to unravel. She closed the door and returned to the bookstore, where old shelves and the smell of damp paper awaited her. But in her heart, a strange feeling lingered, as if that hug hadn't just been for him, but for her too, a part of herself she'd buried long ago. Stepping inside, Emily pulled off her raincoat and hung it on the wooden hook by the door, revealing a simple gray sweater underneath. She brushed back her wet hair, water droplets trailing down her hands, and let out a soft sigh. This wasn't the first time she'd done something like this, helped a stranger with no expectation in return. For her, it was the only way to keep her heart beating after everything she'd lost. Emily, 29, was a gentle and kind woman, but she carried scars that could never fade. 7 years ago, her life shattered when her entire family, her father, mother, and little brother, died in a car accident on R5. A drunk driver had crashed into their car on the way back from a camping trip in Tillamook Forest, a trip she would have joined if not for a weekend shift at Powell's. She survived, but the cost was sleepless nights wondering why she hadn't been with them. Then 3 years ago, before that old wound could heal, a new one tore open. Ethan, her college fiancé, the man she'd dreamed of building a new family with, betrayed her. She found him embracing Sarah, her best friend since high school, in the apartment they'd picked out together just 2 months before their wedding. Emily called off the engagement immediately, returned the ring she'd once cherished, and cut all ties. Since then, she'd chosen a quiet life at Powell's Books, where old books and other people's stories became her refuge. She didn't seek love or attention, but she was always ready to lend a hand to those in need, whether patiently helping a customer find a rare book or quietly packing stacks of used books to send to poor children in rural Oregon. For Emily, kindness wasn't something she tried to show. It was the fragile thread tying her to the world, and perhaps the only way she knew to heal herself. Chapter 2. The Groom Left Behind. The next morning, Portland awoke to a rare, restless energy. The rain had stopped, leaving shimmering puddles on the sidewalks and a faint scent of damp earth in the air. Emily stood behind the counter at Powell's Books, flipping through the pages of an old book about Northwest trees, when Jade, her short-haired, green-dyed co-worker, strode in and slapped the latest issue of Willamette Week onto the counter with a loud thwack, her voice brimming with excitement. "Have you seen this?" Emily looked up, her light brown eyes scanning the bold headline. Tech billionaire Alexander Reed left at altar. Fiancé vanishes before vows. Below it was a blurry photo of a man in a suit standing before an elegant but empty wedding reception table. The article detailed how Alexander Reed, 32, CEO of a prominent social tech company, had been abandoned by his fiancée just before their wedding at a luxurious downtown Portland hotel. No explanation, no trace. The bride simply disappeared 2 hours before the vows. Jade giggled, shaking her head. Drama like this? The whole city'll be buzzing for a week. They say he's cold as ice, but getting ditched like this probably melted him down to water. Emily gave a faint smile but didn't reply. She didn't care for gossip, yet the name Alexander Reed stirred an odd feeling in her, like an unclear puzzle piece. So she closed the book and turned back to sorting a stack of children's books slated for the Gresham Community Library by the weekend. The news spread through Portland like wildfire. By noon, Stumptown Coffee, a few blocks from Powell's, was abuzz with whispers from hipster groups clutching artful lattes, eagerly discussing the jilted billionaire. Some joked that he'd probably programmed an AI bride that glitched and deleted itself. While on social media, the hashtag Reed left at altar climbed the ranks with paparazzi shots of him leaving the hotel, face impassive, eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. But no one knew that the night before, he'd been slumped in the alley behind St. Mary's Church, broken in the arms of a stranger. And Emily, the one who'd held him, had no idea the name in the headlines belonged to that same man. 3 days later, the bell above Powell's door jingled as a man stepped inside. Emily was perched on an old wooden ladder, holding a stack of hardcovers, when she heard steady footsteps approaching. She turned, and her heart skipped a beat. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood there, wearing a dark gray wool coat instead of the soaked black suit she'd seen before. His dark hair was neatly combed, but his deep blue eyes, no longer red-rimmed, still carried the weariness of sleepless nights. In his hand was a crumpled scrap of paper with a few handwritten lines. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low and slightly hoarse. "Do you have The Alchemist?" Emily set the books down and stepped off the ladder, recognizing him instantly, not from the newspaper photo, but from the way his shoulders slumped slightly, as if still bearing an invisible weight. This was the man from the alley, the one she'd hugged in the rain without asking his name. She recalled that fleeting moment when they'd been there together. She'd whispered something about The Alchemist, how it was the book she'd read when she felt lost after her family's death. She hadn't expected him to remember, let alone show up here. "Do you always hug strangers in alleys, or am I just lucky?" he continued, his tone laced with faint sarcasm, but his eyes held a curiosity, as if trying to figure her out. A slight smile flickered across his lips, the first since that night, but it vanished quickly. Emily froze, her cheeks warming slightly. She wasn't good at banter, especially not with this sharp, unexpected kind. "Only when they look like they need it," she replied softly, then turned away to hide her flustered expression, heading toward the classic literature shelves. She tried to stay composed, though her mind spun. "He's Alexander Reed. The man from the alley is Alexander Reed." Before she could grab the book, a voice cut through from the counter. "Hey, isn't that the guy who got dumped?" A customer, a guy with round glasses, whispered to his friend, pointing at Alexander. The murmurs began to spread, curious eyes turning toward him. Alexander's grip tightened on the scrap of paper, his face hardening, a flash of irritation in his eyes. Emily acted quickly, stepping forward and lightly tugging his sleeve, guiding him into a secluded corner behind the sci-fi shelves where thick books blocked the crowd's view. "Don't mind them," she said quietly, her tone reassuring. "Portland loves drama, but they'll forget soon enough." He looked at her, really looked at her for the first time, not as a passerby, but as someone trying to understand something. "You seem used to saving people," he said, his voice lower, the sarcasm gone, replaced by a hint of sincerity. "Let's say I am," she replied, then turned back to the shelf, pulling out a worn paperback copy of The Alchemist and handing it to him. Her hand trembled slightly, but she hid it. "This is my favorite edition. It's not new, but it has soul." Alexander took the book, his fingers brushing the cover as if weighing something. "Thanks," he said simply, but his gaze lingered on her longer than usual. He didn't mention the hug, and neither did she, but they both knew. This wasn't their first meeting, and it might not be their last. When he left, the door's bell jingled again. Emily stood by the shelves, still holding another book she'd meant to sort, watching through Powell's large glass window as he stepped onto the street. His tall figure blended into the crowd. Alexander Reed, she thought, the name now real in her mind. But to her, he wasn't the billionaire or the jilted groom from the headlines. He was just the man from the alley, the one who'd left behind a ring and a question she hadn't yet answered. Alexander Reed, 32, was a man who lived in a world of logic and power. As CEO of a Portland-based social tech company, he was known for his cold demeanor and privacy. He'd built his empire from nothing with sharp intellect and an uncanny ability to predict trends. Few knew he'd grown up in a broken family where affection was a luxury he never had. His fiancée, Sophia, had left him before the wedding because she couldn't handle the media pressure and his distance. A blow that left him feeling out of control for the first time. Emily's hug in the alley was something he hadn't expected, and The Alchemist was why he'd returned. Not just for the book, but for a flicker of light in the darkness he wasn't ready to admit. Chapter 3. Awkward Acquaintances. In the days following their first encounter at Powell's Books, Alexander Reed began showing up more often, an unspoken habit neither he nor Emily addressed. At first, he came with simple excuses, buying books, usually ones Emily had mentioned during their brief embrace in the rain, like The Alchemist or other classics about the search for life's meaning. But gradually, he lingered longer, not just to browse, but to talk deiki, though their conversations often started awkwardly and ended in silence. Emily didn't mind. She enjoyed the quiet peace of those moments. Him standing by the shelves, flipping through pages with a cool focus, while she sorted old books or jotted notes in her small notebook. Powell's, with its towering shelves and the faint scent of damp paper in the air, became their meeting place. Unplanned, unexpected, just the presence of two people who had once touched each other's pain on a rainy night. Emily kept a careful distance, never asking too much, never pressing him to say more than brief replies about books or Portland's weather. She recommended healing books she loved. The Alchemist remained her first pick, followed by Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning or The Night Circus with its gentle magic. But she never probed why he kept coming, though she could guess parts of it. Once he held the copy of The Alchemist he'd bought the week before, flipped to the first page and asked, "Do you really believe the universe helps us find what we want?" Emily smiled, replying, "I believe sometimes we have to help ourselves first, and then the universe follows." He didn't say more, just nodded slightly, but his gaze lingered on her longer than usual, as if weighing something deeper. Not everyone was as at ease with Alexander's presence as Emily. Jade, 25, her best friend and co-worker at Powell's, eyed him suspiciously every time he walked through the door. Petite, with short green-dyed hair, always in indie band t-shirts and a nose ring, Jade was the type to speak her mind, sometimes to the point of discomfort. One afternoon, after Alexander left following a brief chat with Emily about sci-fi books, Jade pulled her to the corner of the counter, voice low but wary. "He's a billionaire, Em. Alexander Reed, the guy all of Portland's talking about for getting left at the altar. You think he's for real, or just taking advantage of your kindness?" Emily frowned, setting her pen down. "What do you mean?" Jade crossed her arms, eyes sharp. "I mean you're too nice and he's... Who knows? Billionaires don't just wander into used bookstores looking for soulmates. I got conned once by a guy claiming he was an artist who got me. Turned out he just wanted rent money. I don't want you hurt again." Emily sighed. She knew Jade meant well. Jade had shared her own story of a brief fling with a deadbeat musician who ditched her after borrowing cash. He never repaid, but she shook her head. "He's not that kind of person. I don't know what he wants, but I'm not giving anything except book suggestions." Jade huffed, "Just be careful," then returned to work, leaving Emily with a fleeting doubt that quickly faded. The connection between Emily and Alexander grew, slow and hesitant, like two strangers trying to navigate an invisible wall. One stormy evening, as Portland was enveloped by wet gusts blowing off the Willamette River, Alexander arrived at Powell's later than usual, his dark gray wool coat soaked, black hair dripping onto the floor. The store was nearing closing time, with only a few straggling customers. Jade had left early, unable to stand the cold. Emily was tidying the counter when he walked in, carrying the scent of rain and a hint of loneliness. "I thought you wouldn't come in this weather," she said, half joking, half serious. He shrugged. "I didn't have anywhere else to go," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, and for the first time, she sensed a crack in his icy shell. They stayed late, the neon lights outside flickering through the big glass window, reflecting raindrops streaking down. Perhaps to break the silence, Alexander approached the ancient coffee machine in the corner, a relic from the 80s the Powell staff kept despite its frequent breakdowns. "Want some coffee?" he asked, holding the stained glass pot. Emily nodded, curious to see him wrestle with a machine even she didn't fully understand. He fumbled, pouring beans in awkwardly, pressing the wrong button, then spilling hot water across the counter as he tried to fix it, a black stain spreading over the wood. "Damn it," he muttered, the first time she'd seen him lose his cool, and she couldn't help it. She burst out laughing, a clear sound cutting through the stillness. Alexander looked up, surprised, then a rare smile tugged at his lips. "I'm not that bad, am I?" Emily shook her head, still laughing. "No, you just look like a kid doing chores for the first time." In that moment, under Powell's warm golden light, he looked at her as if seeing sunlight after a long winter, and she, though she wouldn't admit it, felt her heart lighten. That night, once the coffee machine finally cooperated and they sat across from each other with steaming mugs, Alexander opened up unexpectedly. She left because she couldn't handle the pressure, he said, eyes on his cup, voice flat like he was recounting someone else's story. The media, living with someone like me, cold, distant, she said. I don't blame her, but I don't know how to be different. Emily listened, her hands tightening around her mug, then replied, soft but steady. I used to think I wasn't good enough. My ex-fiancé cheated with my best friend right before our wedding. I wondered what I did wrong, but then I realized it wasn't my fault. I got through it by helping others, because then I stopped thinking about my own pain. Alexander looked up, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time, they weren't just strangers. They were two broken people trying to piece themselves back together. When he left, the rain still fell steadily outside. Emily stood behind the counter, watching his figure fade through the glass. She didn't know what was starting between them, but she felt a shift. Nothing grand or clear, just a small spark, like Powell's light on old book pages, enough to make her look forward to the next time. Chapter 4. The Start of Something Warm. As time passed, the awkward encounters between Emily and Alexander at Powell's Books became an essential part of their lives, though neither acknowledged it aloud. One afternoon in early November, with Portland still clinging to the crisp chill of autumn, Alexander walked into the bookstore with an unusual determination, holding a small ticket stamped with the Portland Book Festival logo, the city's biggest book event, where authors, publishers, and thousands of book lovers gathered each year. He set the ticket on the counter, where Emily was labeling a stack of old books, and said in a low, steady voice, "Come with me next week." Emily looked up, her light brown eyes flashing with surprise, then shook her head with a faint smile. "I'm not good with crowds, you know that. Thousands of people crammed into a convention center. It sounds suffocating just thinking about it." Alexander tilted his head undeterred. "I don't like crowds either, but I thought you'd enjoy the used bookstalls there. They even have a section for kids' books, like the ones you send out." She studied him, noticing a spark in his eyes. Not the usual cool detachment, but a rare sincerity, but she still declined. "I'll think about it, but don't get your hopes up." He didn't give up as easily as she'd expected. Over the next week, Alexander stopped by Powell's almost daily, each time with a new reason to sway her. One day mentioning an author she loved who'd be signing books, another talking about a rare bookstall with imports from Europe, and once just standing by the shelves and asking, "Aren't you even a little curious?" Emily began to find his persistence amusing, but it also softened her resolve. Finally, on a Saturday morning, when he showed up with a different flyer, not for the book festival, but for a book donation event for rural Oregon kids at a small suburban library, she sighed, setting her pen down on the counter. "Fine, but just this. No festival, no crowds." Alexander grinned, a rare smile lighting up his face. "I knew you'd say yes." That day, Portland's sky unexpectedly cleared, the relentless weeks of rain giving way to rare sunshine filtering through the vibrant red maple leaves along the road to the suburbs. Emily sat beside Alexander in his sleek black SUV, feeling a touch out of place, leaving the familiarity of Powell's for something new. They arrived at a small town about 40 minutes from the city, where volunteers were setting up a book donation booth outside the community library. The atmosphere was lively but not overwhelming, with wooden tables piled with children's books, a few kids darting around unopened boxes, and the scent of coffee wafting from a tiny indie cafe across the street. Emily instantly felt more at ease. She stepped out of the car, cradling a box of old books from Powell's she'd picked out beforehand. Titles like The Very Hungry Caterpillar and Charlotte's Web, stories she believed would bring joy to the kids. Alexander, though unaccustomed to events like this, didn't stand on the sidelines. He quietly helped her arrange books on the table, his hands usually at home on a keyboard, fumbling as he stacked them, occasionally dropping a few for her to pick up. "You don't have to do this," she said, but he shrugged. "I didn't come here to watch." They worked in silence for a while until a group of kids, 5 or 6 of them, dressed in colorful fall jackets, ran over, peering curiously at the books. A curly-haired girl about 6 pointed at "Where the Wild Things Are" and asked, "Can you read it to us, mister?" Alexander froze, glancing at Emily for help, but she grinned mischievously and pressed the book into his hands. "Go on, it's not hard." He took the book, sat on a small wooden chair among the kids, and started reading in his deep voice, though he clearly had no idea how to play the storyteller. The night Max wore his wolf suit and made mischief of one kind. He paused, attempting a monster growl that sounded more like a cough, sending the kids into giggles. Emily stood by the nearby coffee table, holding a paper cup of hot latte, unable to hold back her laughter. A bright, clear sound ringing through the peaceful space. Alexander looked up, feigning a frown. "What's so funny?" But even he couldn't stay serious, the corner of his mouth lifting as he saw her delight. The kids clapped and shouted, "Keep going, Monster Man!" And he obliged, adding a bit more expression this time, though still clumsy enough to knock over a water cup nearby. Emily watched him, sunlight streaming through the cafe window, and for the first time, she thought he wasn't the cold man from the alley anymore. He was someone learning to open up little by little. The donation event wrapped up by late afternoon, the sun dipping behind distant hills, painting Oregon's sky a brilliant orange. On the drive back, Alexander was quiet for a while, then said suddenly, "I've never done anything like today. I mean, for other people with no gain." Emily turned to him, slightly surprised. "So why did you?" He kept his eyes on the road, his voice low but firm. "Because of you. You make it look easy, like helping others is the most natural thing in the world." She didn't reply right away, just smiled, a warmth spreading through her like the rare sunshine of that day. A few weeks later, Alexander surprised her again. One morning, he arrived at Powell's not with a book or a question, but with a bigger idea. Inspired by the donation event, he'd funded a mobile library, a small truck filled with books to travel to remote Oregon areas where kids rarely got new reading material. "It'll start running next month," he said, hands in his coat pockets, trying to downplay his pride. Emily stood behind the counter, eyes lighting up. "Really, you're not kidding?" He nodded, then pulled a small wooden box from his pocket and slid it toward her. "And this is for you." She opened it, revealing an antique book press, polished walnut with intricate carvings, something she'd once dreamed of using to restore her beloved old books at the shop. Her hands trembled as she touched it, eyes welling up. "Alexander, I don't know what to say." He shrugged, his voice softer than usual. "You don't have to say anything. I just thought it belonged with you." When he left, Emily stood quietly by the counter, still holding the book press, gazing out Powell's large glass window. The rare Portland sunlight streamed in, illuminating the weathered shelves, and she felt a new beginning, not just for him, but for her too. Alexander was no longer the broken man from the alley, and she was no longer just someone who healed others. Together, they were creating something warm, even if it was only the start. Chapter 5. Ghosts from the Past. Winter arrived in Portland earlier than usual, bringing biting winds that swept through the cobblestone streets and rattled the large glass windows of Powell's books. Emily stood behind the counter, sorting a stack of newly arrived books, her heart lighter than ever after the warm days spent with Alexander. Their relationship had no label, no promises, but she felt a growing connection. Not love, at least not yet, but something genuine, like two imperfect puzzle pieces fitting together. Alexander still visited Powell's regularly, sometimes bringing coffee from Stumptown, sometimes just standing quietly by the shelves and asking about the old books she loved. She began to think that perhaps, after all her losses, she was finding a place to belong. But then, on a late November afternoon, with the sky gray and a steady drizzle pattering on Powell's roof, the shop's door jingled and a woman stepped inside. Not an ordinary customer, but a presence that suddenly weighed down the air. She was tall, with glossy blonde hair tied high, wearing an expensive cream fur coat, her high heels clicking rhythmically on the wooden floor. Emily looked up, mildly surprised but unconcerned, until the woman marched straight to the secluded corner where Alexander stood, holding a copy of Dune he'd intended to buy. "Alex," her voice rang out, soft yet sharp, "I need to talk to you." Emily froze, her hand still on a book. And then it hit her. This was Sophia, Alexander's ex-fiancée, the one who'd left him at the altar, the one all of Portland had buzzed about. Alexander set the book down, his face hardening, his deep blue eyes flashing with irritation. "Sophia," he said, his voice icy, "what do you want?" Sophia stepped closer, her hands clasped as if steadying herself. "I'm sorry, Alex. I know I was wrong to leave. The pressure, the media, everything. I couldn't handle it, but I've thought it over. I want to come back, to fix things." Her voice trembled, her eyes glistening as if on the verge of tears. But Alexander shook his head, cutting her off. "No, Sophia, I don't want to hear it. You chose to leave, and I've accepted that. There's nothing left between us." Sophia stood still, her lips pressed tight, then turned away, but not before whispering, "You'll regret this." Emily hadn't meant to eavesdrop. She was in the back stockroom, a few meters away, holding a box of old books she'd planned to shelve. Through a narrow gap in the door, she unintentionally witnessed it all. The way Sophia touched his shoulder, the flicker of hesitation in his eyes for a split second before he refused. Her chest tightened, not from jealousy, but from an old fear resurfacing. The fear that she wasn't enough, that she was just a stand-in, a temporary balm for a broken heart. She stepped back, leaning against the shelves, her trembling hand brushing the copy of The Alchemist she always kept close like a talisman. The book's words echoed in her mind. "When you want something, all the universe conspires to help you." But in that moment, she wondered, did the universe truly want her here, or was she just fooling herself? For the rest of the day, Emily couldn't focus. She dropped a book, mixed up a customer's coffee order, and when Alexander approached the counter to ask if she was okay, she forced a smile. "I'm fine, just a little tired." He didn't push, but his eyes, once bright when he read to the kids, now felt stifling. She began to rethink everything, his visits to Powell's, the stories he shared, the book press he'd given her. Was he just using her to forget Sophia? Was she merely a placeholder, a kind soul he leaned on when no one else was there? The thought lodged in her mind like a small knife piercing old scars. The car accident that took her family, Ethan's betrayal, and she told herself, "I can't let it happen again." That night in her small East Portland apartment, Emily stood before her personal bookshelf, running her fingers over The Alchemist, her eyes blurring with tears. She recalled his words about Sophia. "She couldn't handle my coldness," and wondered if he'd truly rejected her, or if it was just a moment of hesitation he'd later reconsider. She flipped open the book, rereading her favorite line. "When you want something," but this time, it didn't comfort her. She snapped it shut, sat at her table, and wrote a resignation letter to Powell's manager. She couldn't stay, couldn't keep being someone's temporary fix, even if that someone was Alexander. She decided to leave, not just Powell's, but Portland, for Seattle, where a nonprofit educational organization had offered her a job months earlier. It was a chance to start over, to focus on helping others without risking her heart again. Jade was the first to know, and she wasn't happy. The next morning, when Emily arrived at Powell's to submit her letter, Jade dragged her to the counter's corner, her voice sharp. "What are you doing, Em? Quitting? Moving? Just because that billionaire talked to his old flame?" Emily sighed, trying to explain. "It's not about him, Jade. It's about me. I don't want to get caught in that cycle again, trusting someone, then finding out I'm not enough." Jade crossed her arms, eyes piercing. "You're always helping others, always healing them. Why not yourself? Running away like this, you're letting him win, or letting the past win." Emily shook her head, her voice quiet but firm. "I'm not giving up. I just need time to figure out what I want." Jade huffed, turning away, but not before muttering, "I'll miss you, but I hate how you're running like this." Before leaving Portland, Emily did one last thing. Late that evening, after Powell's had closed, she used her staff key to slip inside. She walked to the secluded corner where Alexander often stood, placing The Alchemist on the small table he used for reading, along with a handwritten note. "Find your treasure." She wrote nothing more, offered no explanation, and quietly left, taking the book press he'd given her and a small suitcase of clothes. The next day, she boarded a Greyhound bus to Seattle, staring out the window as Portland faded behind the hills, her heart empty yet relieved. She didn't know if she was right or wrong, but she knew she needed distance. From Alexander, from Powell's, from the hope she'd begun to build. Back in Portland, Alexander stepped into Powell's a few days later, looking for her as usual, only to find Jade behind the counter, her gaze cold. "She's gone," Jade said, sliding the alchemist toward him. "She left this for you." He took the book, read her note, and for the first time in months, he felt an emptiness he couldn't explain. Not because of Sophia, but because of Emily, who left without a goodbye. Chapter 6. The Search. The day Emily left, Alexander had no idea, still caught up in meetings and plans for the mobile library he'd funded because of her. But when he stepped into Powell's Books one weekend afternoon, carrying a Stumptown coffee as usual, he sensed something was off. The counter was empty, no sign of Emily with her gentle smile or deft hands sorting books. Jade stood there instead, her gaze cold, and before he could ask, she slid the alchemist toward him, her voice flat. "She's gone. Left this for you." He took the book, his fingers tracing Emily's handwritten note. "Find your treasure." And for the first time in his life, Alexander Reed, a man always in control, felt panic. He looked at Jade, his voice urgent. "Gone where? When?" Jade shrugged. "Seattle a few days ago. She didn't say much, but I'd guess it's because of you and that blonde ex of yours." He stood frozen, the book heavy in his hands. A wave of loss washing over him unlike anything since Sophia left. But this time it cut deeper because he realized, too late, that it wasn't just hurt. It was love, something he hadn't recognized until she was gone. Alexander couldn't sit still. He left Powell's immediately, the alchemist tucked into his coat pocket, and began scouring Portland for her, as if she might just be hiding somewhere in the city. He drove to the Multnomah Library, where she'd once mentioned loving to read on her days off, but found only silent shelves and strangers flipping pages. He stopped by Voodoo Donut, where she'd once bought a box of pink frosted donuts for the kids at the donation event, asking the staff if they'd seen a light brown-haired girl in a yellow raincoat. But they shook their heads, busy with an endless line of customers. He returned to Powell's daily, hoping Jade might relent and give him more clues. But she just stared at him with a mix of anger and pity. "She doesn't want you to find her, Reed. Let her be." But he couldn't, not with the book she left him weighing in his hands like a reminder. A compass he didn't know how to read. Days passed and Portland turned into a maze of memories. Every street corner, every cafe stirring thoughts of her. One drizzly morning, walking through the Pearl District, he glimpsed a brown-haired girl in a faded yellow raincoat stepping out of a small flower shop. His heart pounded. He shouted, "Emily!" across the street, his voice echoing over the hum of traffic and pattering rain. The girl turned, but it wasn't Emily. Just a stranger with startled eyes looking at him like he'd lost his mind. "Sorry, my mistake," he mumbled, turning away, his face hot with embarrassment, though a foolish spark of hope flared that she might still be nearby. He stood in the rain for a moment, clutching the alchemist in his pocket, wondering if she'd truly left him or if he just hadn't found the right place. After a week of fruitless searching in Portland, Alexander widened his hunt. He recalled a passing conversation when Emily mentioned Seattle. She'd once talked about a nonprofit educational organization there that had offered her a job, which she'd turned down to stay at Powell's. It was his only lead, and he didn't hesitate. He drove up I-5, the 170-plus mile stretch from Portland to Seattle, carrying her book like a talisman, his heart heavy but unable to stop. Seattle greeted him with a gray sky no different from Portland's, but the pace here was faster, louder, with towering buildings and bustling crowds. He didn't know where to start, only drove through neighborhoods, checked public libraries and used bookstores, even asked around Pike Place Market with the slim hope someone might have seen her. But no one knew an Emily Carter, and he began to feel like a fool chasing a shadow she didn't want him to catch. Then on a weekend afternoon, just as he was about to give up, he spotted a flyer taped to a lamppost near Capitol Hill. An event by a nonprofit educational group reading, Story time for immigrant children, bringing knowledge to the community. He wasn't sure if it was her organization, but instinct told him to go. He drove to the location, a small, warm community center with pale yellow walls and the sound of children's chatter spilling out. As he stepped inside, the alchemist still in hand, he heard a familiar voice, gentle yet clear, reading aloud. And then the boy realized, sometimes the most magical things aren't in books, but in the people you meet. He froze in the doorway, his heart skipping a beat. It was Emily, sitting among a group of immigrant kids, holding the boy who fell off the Mayflower, her eyes alight as she told the story. She wore a simple gray sweater, her light brown hair tied loosely, and her smile, the one he'd seen when he clumsily read "Where the Wild Things Are," made him forget where he stood. The kids clapped as she finished, and she stood, telling them in a warm voice, "Books don't fix people. People fix each other." Alexander's throat tightened, the book in his hand trembling as he realized what he'd denied all this time. He loved her, not because she'd saved him in that alley, but because she was the only one who made him want to be a better version of himself. He stepped forward but didn't dare speak, just stood silently in the room, watching her from afar, afraid that if he got closer, she'd vanish again. Emily turned and her eyes met his. She stopped, her hands tightening around the book, her face flashing through a cascade of emotions, surprise, confusion, then a hint of something like pain. She said nothing, just stared, and he didn't know how to begin. But the alchemist in his hand, the one she left with "Find your treasure," felt like an answer now. He'd found his treasure, not in his company, not in the things he once thought mattered, but in her, the one who'd left and forced him to search. He took a step toward her, still holding the book, his heart full of a feeling he'd never named. Not hope, not fear, but a certainty that, whether she agreed or not, he wouldn't let her disappear again. Chapter 7. Reunited, with Purpose. The community center in Seattle buzzed with the chatter of children as they filtered out of the room, leaving Emily standing quietly among the small wooden chairs, still clutching the boy who fell off the Mayflower. Her eyes locked onto Alexander, who stood at the threshold, the alchemist in hand, his face a mix of resolve and unease she'd never seen before. The space between them grew heavy, as if all the days apart, the misunderstandings, and the pain converged in this single moment. Emily opened her mouth to speak but hesitated, unsure where to begin. Alexander stepped forward, each footfall echoing on the old wooden floor, and when he was just a few steps away, he stopped, his voice low and trembling. "Emily, I'm sorry." She frowned, a flicker of doubt in her eyes, but he didn't let her interrupt. He held up the alchemist, as if it were proof of what he was about to say. "I didn't know where you'd gone, didn't know what you were thinking, but when I saw you and Sophia talking that day, I turned her away." I didn't waver, not for a second. She's the past, and I don't want her back. But I didn't realize you'd seen. Didn't realize you thought I still cared. I searched for you all over Portland, then came here, because I couldn't let you go without making things clear. Emily stood still, her grip tightening on her book, her heart swirling between old pain and new spark of hope. "Why didn't you say it sooner?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. He sighed, his gaze meeting hers. "Because I was an idiot. Because I didn't know how much I needed you until you were gone." Silence settled for a moment, broken only by the faint patter of rain outside the community center. Emily looked at him, seeing the sincerity in those once cold blue eyes, and felt a part of her heart soften. But before she could respond, Alexander closed the distance, pulling her into a hug, not tentative or awkward like that first embrace in the alley, but firm and warm, as if he were giving her his entire world. She stiffened in surprise but didn't pull away, feeling his breath against her hair. And then he whispered, his voice hoarse but steady, "I needed that first hug to survive. But this one, I need it to live." His words struck her like a sweet blade, dissolving the last of her doubts, and she wrapped her arms around him, her eyes blurring with tears. They stood like that for a long time, in the empty room, like two lost souls finally finding each other. When they pulled apart, Emily wiped her eyes, offering a faint smile. "I'm not coming back to Portland just because you hugged me." Alexander laughed, a rare smile lighting up his face. I know, but I hope you'll give me a chance to make things right. She studied him, thinking for a moment, then said, her voice firm, okay, but on one condition. We don't just live for each other. I want to do something bigger. Not just books, not just hugs, but something that helps people like we used to be. People who need someone when they're broken. Alexander nodded instantly, without hesitation. Whatever you want, I'll do it. And from that, the idea for the Hug Foundation was born, a nonprofit focused on mental health, building community libraries, and supporting women through crises, those who'd lost like Emily, been betrayed like her, or felt lost like Alexander. They returned to Portland together, not as a clearly defined couple, but as partners with a shared purpose. Emily went back to Powell's, but now part-time, pouring most of her energy into laying the groundwork for the organization. Alexander, with his resources, turned the idea into reality fast. He hired a small team of mental health experts, reached out to publishers for book donations, and secured a modest office in East Portland as headquarters. They named it the Hug Foundation, a simple yet profound title that echoed the embrace that had changed them both. Emily designed the logo, an open book with two arms embracing, while Alexander networked with donors to get the project off the ground. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Just months after launching, they hit their first hurdle, funding shortages. Though Alexander had dipped into his own pockets to start it, the costs of running the mobile library, offering free counseling sessions, and aiding women post-crisis far exceeded his estimates. Early donors hesitated, wanting proof of results before committing long-term, and the budget dwindled fast. One evening, in the Hug Foundation's small office, Emily sat amid stacks of papers, staring anxiously at the financial balance sheet. If we don't get more money, we'll have to cut the mobile library, or worse, shut down some programs. Alexander, seated across from her, tapped his fingers on the table, lost in thought, then said, I'll sell part of my company shares. Not a lot, but enough to keep us going a few more months. Emily looked up, startled. Are you sure? That's your company, Alexander. He shrugged, his tone calm. The company's what I built to prove I could. This is what I want to keep, for you, for the people we're helping. His decision breathed new life into the effort, but Emily didn't want it all to rest on him. She suggested a fundraising book day at Powell's, a big event with readings, used book sales, and a call for Portland's community to join in. She reached out to Jade, who'd softened toward her since her return, for help, and Jade agreed instantly. I still think you're crazy for forgiving him, but if it's for this, I'm in. The event took place on a weekend when Portland's rain paused, rare sunlight streaming through the shop's large windows. Hundreds showed up, donating books, buying old titles from Powell's, and listening as Emily and Alexander shared the Hug Foundation's mission. Kids from the mobile library came too, clutching favorite books and telling their stories, moving more than a few to tears. By day's end, they'd raised enough to sustain the organization for 6 more months, and Emily stood in Powell's, gazing at the crowd, feeling a pride she'd never known before. As the event wrapped up, Alexander approached her, holding 2 Stumptown coffees, an old habit of theirs. He handed her one, smiling. We did it. Emily took the cup, looked at him, and said, It's not that we did it, it's that we're starting. This is just the first step. He nodded, his eyes bright. Then I'll walk with you step by step. They stood there in Powell's amid old shelves and the community's laughter. No longer just 2 broken people, but 2 who'd found purpose. Not just for themselves, but for others. The Hug Foundation wasn't just an organization. It was a promise that no one would have to be alone in their own dark alley, as they once were. Chapter 8. Epilogue. The Alley That Started It All. 3 years had passed since Emily and Alexander reunited in Seattle, and Portland now breathed with a new vitality, not just because autumn had returned with its blazing red maple leaves, but because something greater had blossomed from the small alley behind St. Mary's Church. Once a dark, damp corner where Emily had hugged a stranger in the rain, it was now painted with vibrant murals, open books, clasped hands, and a large inscription on a wooden sign, Hug Alley, where healing begins. The idea had come from Emily shortly after they founded the Hug Foundation, a way to transform their starting point into a symbol for anyone needing a hug, a kind word, or simply a place to feel less alone. Alexander, ever practical, made it happen. He hired local artists to paint the walls, installed solar-powered streetlights, and turned the alley into a quiet Portland destination where people could pause, leave a positive note on a wall, or sit on wooden benches placed there for reflection. That day was the third annual Hug Day, an event Emily and Alexander held to inspire small acts of kindness across the city. Powell's books buzzed with laughter and voices as hundreds gathered, donating books, sharing free hugs, or writing messages to hang on the kindness wall. The Hug Foundation had set up outside the shop. Kids from the mobile library darted around the stalls, clutching favorite books, while volunteers handed out donuts from Voodoo Donut and hot coffee from Stumptown. Emily stood amid the crowd, dressed in a simple gray sweater, holding a latte, watching everyone with a radiant smile. She was no longer the quiet girl in the bookstore. She was part of something bigger, a community she and Alexander had built from their own broken pieces. Alexander stood nearby, holding the hand of a 1-year-old boy with light brown hair like his mother's and deep blue eyes like his father's. This was Oliver, their son, born just over a year ago, a sweet gift after they decided to commit to each other forever. Their wedding had taken place 2 years earlier, quiet and unassuming, in a small East Portland church with only a handful of close friends. Jade as bridesmaid, still joking that, "I can't believe you married that billionaire," and a simple vow, they'd not only love each other, but live for others. Oliver arrived later as a joyful surprise, a charming boy with a wide grin, always fiddling with the books his mom brought home. Alexander, though still reserved with strangers, was now a clumsy but devoted dad, learning to change diapers, mix formula, and sometimes singing off-key lullabies to Oliver in his deep voice, making Emily laugh every time she heard it. Hug Day wasn't just an event, it was a reminder of the journey they'd traveled over the past 3 years. As rare Portland sunlight streamed through Powell's large windows, Emily stepped out to Hug Alley, holding a small note she planned to pin to the wall. She paused, gazing at the now bright and welcoming alley, and memories of that first hug rushed back like a gentle breeze. She recalled that rainy night, kneeling beside a broken man, not knowing who he was, only that he needed someone. She remembered his stifled sobs blending with the rain, the way he relaxed in her arms, and the wedding ring she'd picked up and slipped into his pocket. Back then, she thought she was just helping a stranger, but now she realized that hug hadn't only pulled Alexander from his darkness, it had saved her from the loneliness she'd buried after her own losses. She smiled, wrote on the note, "One hug can change everything," and hung it on the wall, joining hundreds of other messages swaying in the breeze. Alexander approached her, Oliver toddling behind, clutching a small children's book he'd grabbed from a stall. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice low but gentle. Emily turned to him, looking at him and their son, then replied, "That first hug. If I hadn't done it, we wouldn't be here today. No Hug Alley, no Hug Day, no Oliver." He gave a soft laugh, bending down to scoop Oliver into his arms. "I think about that every day. You saved me, Emily, and not just that night." She leaned her head against his shoulder, feeling the warmth of him and Oliver, and for the first time in years she felt whole. Not just because she'd found love, but because she'd found purpose, a family, and a way to embrace the world. The Hug Foundation, after 3 years, had grown far beyond its shaky early days. Thanks to fundraisers and community support, they'd expanded the mobile library to neighboring states like Washington and Idaho, added more free mental health counseling sessions, and built a small center dedicated to women post-crisis, a place where they could learn skills, read books, or simply find a safe space to heal. Emily and Alexander didn't stop there. They kept working together, now balancing their efforts with raising Oliver. Some nights they sat in the foundation's small office, Oliver asleep in a crib nearby, planning new projects. Other days they brought him to community events, raising him with the understanding that happiness comes not just from receiving, but from giving. As Hug Day drew to a close, The sun set behind Oregon's hills, painting the sky a brilliant orange. Emily and Alexander stood in Hug Alley, Oliver in his stroller beside them, still hugging his little book, his eyes drooping with sleep. They watched the crowd disperse, smiles on their faces. An elderly man approached, thanking them for the joy the mobile library brought his grandkids. A young woman hugged Emily, saying the Women's Center had helped her stand again after her husband left. These moments, small but meaningful, were why they never gave up. Emily turned to Alexander, taking his hand. "We've done it, haven't we?" He squeezed her hand, replying, "No, we're still doing it, and I'll be here, with you always." Their story began with a hug in the rain, in a dark alley no one noticed. Now that alley stood as a symbol of hope, kindness, and a love grown from wounds. Emily looked at Hug Alley, at Alexander and Oliver, and knew she hadn't just hugged a stranger once. She was hugging the world, with him by her side. She hugged a stranger once. Now she hugs the world, with him by her side. Thank you for following this heartfelt story of Soul Stories channel. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. If you believe that true love can withstand all trials and sometimes begins in the simplest of ways, don't forget to hit the like button and share this story with your friends. To never miss out on touching and meaningful stories, subscribe to our channel and help us spread messages of love and warmth to everyone. Let's cherish the beautiful moments of life and love together.